Good afternoon. Is this working? Yes, I think this is working. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christine Bacharach, and I'm Acting Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third annual Matilda White Riley Lecture in the Behavioral and Social Sciences. I am not Ron Abels, so don't believe what you read in your program. Ron was called away unexpectedly, and I'm just filling in for him. This annual lecture honors the outstanding contributions of Matilda White Riley to the behavioral and social sciences and to the NIH. In addition to serving as Associate Director for Behavioral and Social Science Research at the National Institute on Aging, Dr. Riley provided leadership across the NIH in her role as chairperson of landmark committees regarding health and behavior. She was co-chair of the steering committee for the Institute of Medicine's project on health and behavior, and she was chair of a trans-NIH working group on health and behavior. And in these capacities, she served as the senior NIH spokesperson for the behavioral and social sciences. She encouraged coordination across the NIH behavioral and social science community, and she initiated the Behavioral and Social Science Seminar Series at the NIH. In short, she laid the foundation on which the behavioral and social science community of the NIH and the OBSSR was founded. So we owe her a great debt. Prior to her NIH service, she had an extraordinary career. I was reading some of her accomplishments just this morning, and a sampling includes she helped to establish a pioneering market research company in 1939. She served as the chief consulting economist for the U.S. War Production Board during World War II. She held professorships at both Rutgers University and Bowdoin College, and she was the first female full professor at Bowdoin College. When she retired from the NIH in 1998, she was appointed a scientist emeritus, and I think is still the only social scientist ever to receive that honor. So this annual award and lecture honors an individual whose research has contributed to behavioral and social science knowledge and its application to the mission of the NIH. And the recipient is chosen to reflect someone, to be someone whose work really reflects the values that characterize Matilda Riley's commitment to research. These values included strong linkages among theory, methods, and research goals, a perspective that attends to multiple levels of influence on health, cells to society, and a perspective that goes over the life course, a broadened focus on health to include not only biological outcomes but effective functioning, and an optimistic view of the ability of the social and behavioral sciences to improve the lives of people of all ages. This year's Matilda White Riley awardee is Dr. John McKinlay. Dr. McKinlay is an internationally prominent epidemiologist with interests and experience in public health. Currently, he is Senior Vice President and Chief Scientist of New England Research Institutes, and he was for several decades a distinguished academic and administrator at Boston University. He held 3 simultaneous professorships in medicine, biostatistics, and epidemiology, and sociology. He directed BU's Center for Health and Advanced Policy Studies and its Gerontology Institute. He's been a member of the Division of Medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital, part of Harvard Medical School, for 25 years. He is the recipient of many awards and honors, including an NIH Merit Award, an American Psychological Association Award for distinguished and pioneering contributions to research on women's health, and the American Sociological Association's Leo G. Reeder Award for distinguished contributions to medical sociology. He's the author, co-author, or editor of over 300 professional papers and 17 books. And this year, he is the 2008 recipient of the American Sociological Association's most prestigious award for lifetime distinguished contributions to the practice of sociology. His lifelong career in social epidemiology began in his native New Zealand, where he studied heart disease among native Maoris and the health consequences of migration by Polynesian islanders. Since the 1970s, he's collaborated in the study of menopause. This culminated in a highly regarded Massachusetts women's health study, and also he made pioneering contributions in the fields of endocrinology, urology, cardiovascular disease, geriatrics, and behavioral medicine through the Massachusetts Male Aging Study. He's presently engaged in research on the epidemiology of erectile dysfunction and osteoporosis, and on how non-medical factors influence clinical decision-making in both the U.S. and the UK. Dr. McKinlay's work abundantly exemplifies both the spirit and the achievements of Matilda Riley's life, and we are fortunate to have him here today to speak with us. But before he begins, we have a little presentation to make. We have, and John, if you'll come up. We have I can get in our box, a glass sculpture which commemorates this lecture and Dr. McKinlay's selection as the third annual Matilda White Riley Lecturer in the Behavioral and Social Sciences.
Thank you very much.
So I introduce Dr. McKinlay.
Thank you very much.
And
thank you very much indeed. It's great to see so many familiar faces and old friends, or I knew them when they were younger friends actually, but it's good to see folks here. I'm going to cover quite a lot of material today, but it really does exemplify the work that Matilda developed. Some of this work which is multidisciplinary, longitudinal, looking at aging, really I wanted to say still continues. This was work that was started at the NIA when Matilda Riley was in charge of the behavioural program, and believe it or not, this work still continues today and to be very productive. Starting out as a behavioural program, social science program, eventually adopted by other institutes. One study in particular has become the landmark study on hormone changes in aging men, and we've published on that one about 75 papers, mainly not in behavioural science journals, but in the journal of, believe it or not, here it comes, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. But that is actually a study that was started in the behavioural science program at the NIA. So today we're going to be talking about upstream determinants of downstream disparities. And I want to focus this talk a little bit by concentrating on diabetes, which is a big problem, as we all know. So I want to deal here today with 5 things. Thing 1, I want to just briefly introduce the issue of race, make some comments on race-ethnic disparities. I want to say something, secondly, about theory, because you can't be a social scientist in behaviour without a theory. Every social scientist has to have one. Thirdly, I want to talk a little bit about our research approach. Thing 4, some results, very briefly, and some conclusions and some implications. So that's the outline of the talk. And if I run out of time and I only get to 3, well, you can hook me up. Now, I think this really reflects a story that my colleague at Boston University used to tell all the time. And I think with respect to social disparities, we're looking for social disparity causes in all the wrong places. Selffulfilling, my colleague and friend at BU, used to tell the story of this guy late one night who lost his keys. He was going to his car in a parking lot, and he lost his keys and dropped his keys. And so instead of looking there, he went over by the entrance of the parking lot and was looking for his keys. And this guy came along and said, "What are you doing?" He says, "I lost my keys by my car, I'm looking for them." And he says, "Well, why are you looking here and not over there where you dropped them?" He said, "But this is where the light is." Now, I think that really reflects what we often call upstream, downstream approaches to public health, or the cause of causes. And instead of looking at risk factors which explain a trivial amount of the variance in anything we're looking at, maybe there are more important upstream social, cultural factors which contribute a lot to what the answer to what we are really looking for. And that maybe our effort downstream looking at risk behaviours is somewhat misplaced, although it's important because you can get some benefit there. Now, to focus the discussion more, so we're going to be looking at upstream. And this is from N. Haynes, but it can be from the NIDDK website. You can go online and get this from CDC. As you all know, there are profound race-ethnic differences in the prevalence of diabetes in the United States. That's the latest N. Haynes data. So the prevalence rate, we're talking about type 2 diabetes here, the prevalence rate is about twice as high in black African American population as it is in the white. Now, how do you explain that? Well, we've proposed a model which I think OBSSR in some form has adopted in a recent publication, and this was first published by I published this in Lancet a couple of years ago, and it reminds me of the old story, a question asked by John Potter, who was an Australian epidemiologist, but I'll forgive him for that. And he said, "What gets cancer? Does a gene get cancer? Does an organ system get cancer? Does a population group get cancer? Does a region of the country? What gets cancer?" Now that simple question opened up the whole idea of multi-level explanations. So if you've got diabetes, or talking about diabetes here, there are at the most elemental level in this explanation physiologic influences like genetics, family history, and possibly hormones and other things. Now, appropriate unto the level must be the intervention thereof. So if you're at the physiologic level, you're usually involved in cure, treatment, or secondary prevention. If you move upstream a little bit further, looking at smoking, diet, and physical activity, which also have been shown to influence diabetes and its course, there you're mainly concerned with primary and secondary prevention. If you look further upstream, you're looking at the people who talk about place, housing condition, neighbourhood economics, healthcare access, the utilisation of services, and clinical decision making. And if you're trying to intervene there, you're really focusing at the level of, these are not exclusive interventions, but you're focusing there on organisation and community interventions. And if you're really moving beyond, for example, place, the second to the top, to social structure, then you're talking about people's place in society, position in society. Not place, geographic location, but position in society, the position of women, the position of minorities, of age, and race, ethnicity. And the proper intervention there, or the appropriate intervention there, is, of course, healthy public policy. So we all know that. That's all elementary. Now, starting with genetics, there are obviously, at the bottom level, there are some promising developments. I'm not going to talk about any of these things at any length, except to say that the differences between people, the genetic differences between people, certainly don't explain the magnitude of the differences between people in disease, in the same disease. And the problem for a psychologist, sociologist, or a behavioural scientist generally with this approach is genetic reductionism. So you can find a needle in a haystack with a gene, but the needle doesn't explain the haystack. So a very important person in epidemiology in Britain recently moved from the London School is Tony McMichael, who says that the basic problem with genetics is that it's the old germ theory in disguise, the 19th century germ theory, where every disease had to have a germ, and today every disease has to have a gene. And maybe there is a gene, but it really doesn't explain the haystack. There are a lot of other things going on. Bright, shiny needles are being discovered every day, but they do not explain the haystack. So, biophysiologic influence. It's good to see a former NERI colleague here. She'll remember the study. This is the Boston Area Community Health Survey data, which is a major investment from the NIDDK in a large population sample, 5,500, randomly sampled from the general population of Boston, half white, third white, third African American, third Hispanic, women and men, broad age span. And one of the things we were looking at in this, where we interviewed these folks and got blood samples and looked at hormone levels, and of course some of the race ethnic differences in some diseases like prostate cancer and diabetes are explained by some people looking at hormone levels. Now when we produced this is a large number of people, and this was total testosterone. It doesn't matter, it's free testosterone, bioavailable testosterone, free androgen index, SHBG, LH, it doesn't matter what you look at. When we actually did this analysis, we produced a figure for blacks, figures for Hispanics, and we wanted to show them. But do you know what? They're all on top of each other there. That green line across the middle is actually blacks, blacks, whites, and Hispanics for total testosterone. The same applies for any other endocrine value you assay. So there are actually no racial ethnic differences in our data. Very large number, well assayed, high reliability, good lab, no lab variability in the data to speak of. And it shows that, I did this work with a woman called, a statistician called Dr. Lippman. And it basically questions whether the hormone explanation of diabetes disparities is a viable one. Going on to risk factorology, which I have some concerns about. And this here, let me explain this cartoon. This is what you hear. You turn on the news tonight, you'll hear about a new risk factor. I guarantee if you turn on any news channel tonight, you'll hear about it. Now this guy is reporting the news, pressing the button to spin the wheel. So on the left here you've got the risk behaviour, in the middle here you've got the disease, and in the right you've got the, what is that? Population. So here you have, he presses the button, so smoking causes depression in rats. You see that? Now, the problem is that we are tooling through observational data to try and find the explanation for disparities. Now, does anyone have an idea, you know the notion of a generalized R squared, where you put everything in the model and you find out what is the relative contribution of certain things to some outcome, right? If you like, the amount of variation explained. Simple, put it simply. So these risk factor studies are all done individually. So they magnify the importance of an individual risk factor. Do you know how many, anyone know how many risk factors there are for coronary heart disease? 350, 380. And that includes all the usual ones, plus not having a siesta, eating mackerel, and so forth, right? And earlobe thickness and male pattern baldness, right? Now, so risk factorology, and we're all sort of been suckered into this risk factorology, and many of these risk factors explain a trivial amount of the variation. We mount an intervention and we find out on this to try and improve the disease, and we wonder, lo and behold, we don't get any really beneficial result. But in actual fact, to start with, it doesn't explain very much. Does anyone know, in our analysis on this BARC data, big population, How much of the variance in diabetes is explained by, say, race family history? Anyone have any idea? What would you think of the total variance explained by, well, if you put all the risk factors together, it explains about 11% of the variation. And of that 11%, race ethnicity explains 1%. What explains 30% of that 11% is body composition. So there are other things going on. Look at this one. So everyone thinks there are race ethnic differences in diabetes, and I've shown you that when I started. But when you control for the effect of SES, what does this show? It shows that diabetes is about twice as prevalent in the lower class, in every race ethnic group. So something is happening here that needs to be attended to. Theoretical background, that's the background. Theoretical background. For those who, this is going back to Epidemiology 101. So I'm writing this book on health policy right now, and I'm working with a nationally syndicated columnist called cartoonist, called Mark Tonra. He's in about 300 papers nationwide, and I come up with these crazy ideas, and he draws the diagram. So here we have the rate, this is the track to an epidemiologic rate. This is what we all learn in Epidemiology 101. Many people start on the track to an epidemiologic rate. So they're all lined up at the beginning here, and to make it to a rate, which is at the end of the process, we've got to first of all recognise the symptom. So if you're having frequent urination, or you've got some loss of weight, or you're having problems with sleep, or you're thirsty all the time, then you go to the doctor. If you don't, you're out of the picture. In the United States, you could recognise the symptom, but you've got to clear the hurdle of health insurance. If you clear the hurdle of health insurance, you recognise the symptom, you go to the doctor, you can get access, the doctor's got to recognise the problem. And then if they recognise the problem, of course, it's not over. Then you've got certain things that are covered and not covered, depending on the... So who'll get counted at the end in the race to this epidemiologic rate? Whoops, I've gone too far. This is another one. So this is, I could go on about the theory with Ed Lemert and Sheff and Becker and all these people, but this summarises the whole thing. I don't mean to simplify it, but we don't have a lot of time. What happens here, all these people are more or less the same size. All right, they're overweight, couple eating ice creams, some black, some women, guys, etc. And the middle guy is the policeman. The MD is the traffic officer. So if you are white and you're overweight and you're middle-aged or whatever, you get sent by that traffic officer to the left. Heart disease. If you are, as one guy said to me, because I'm at the Mass General all the time, he said to me, I see an overweight black patient, male black patient, I think diabetes. So the guy who's black goes down the middle, eating his ice cream. See that? But in every feature other than black, he's the same as the guy going down heart disease route. And then a woman presents with the same problem, and she gets sent off for emotional disorders. Listen, I'm not going any further with that point. Now that's the sort of the cartoon that Mark has drawn. So what I'm questioning here is the epistemologic foundation of epidemiologic rates. So over on the left here is the true distribution of whatever the hell it is you're studying in society. It could be child abuse, it could be diabetes, it could be coronary heart disease. And you've got to recognise the symptoms, and your cultural group, they have to have some salience to go to the doctor. And for some people, for example, urologic symptoms, which we've been studying, have no salience at all, and they get up 3 or 4 or 5 times a night, and that's normal because they're getting old jack, what do you expect? And then you've got to have insurance, I told you. Now, what this talk is all about is where I was right back at the red piece on that multi-level explanation, which is the doctor-patient encounter. And this work that I'm going to be describing has been developed over a number of years, some of it with support from the National Institute but the Aging Institute, some from the Heart, Lung and Blood Institute, and recently we're doing work looking at urologic problems. And what I'm trying to say is, as a result of this filtering process, that's the arrows going down, the actual observed outcome rates in the red on the right are within the general parameters of the blue circle, but they have they do not reflect what's really going on, because the case does not become a health statistic if it doesn't make it to the doctor patient and gets counted as something. So you've got to recognise the problem, which could be thirst and frequent urination and indicating diabetes. You've got to go to the system, got to recognise it as a problem, get into the system, the doctor's got to get it right, and then you get counted as a rate. And epidemiologic rates, as you know, when you look at all other things, they are the sum total of all these individual encounters. That's what the rates are. So, to remind you of Thomas and Zanacki's work, I'm wondering if these rates at the very end here are self-fulfilling prophecies, and that maybe some, but not all of the disparities, I'm not saying all of it, that occurring with respect to race, ethnic differences and diabetes are a result of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because when people define situations as real, they become real in their consequences. We all learnt that in introductory sociology. And I don't mean to quote old figures because I'm a young guy, but Robert Merton once said, in the beginning, a false definition of the situation evokes a new behaviour, which makes the originally false conception come true. It perpetuates what Merton called is a reign of error. In my view, the reign of error is Bayesian reasoning. Now, the research approach. And this is an approach that has been fine-tuned and developed over 10 years, often with support from people in this room. And it's really now beginning to take off an enormous amount of productivity. So we want to disentangle the process of making the way in which doctors make decisions with respect to diabetes. And we want to see if what they're doing is contributing to the race-ethnic disparities at the end that we're seeing. Now, there are two general ways we can do this. The usual way, which is what everyone does, is observational studies. I'm no longer a big proponent of observational studies, and because there's so much confounding. And you can do all the multivariate gymnastics in the world, but you can never ever remove the problem of confounding, of estimates of associations. So the only way you can really do this and disentangle, for example, the effect of age and gender or race and socioeconomic status, for example, is to do an experiment. So with some of the superb statisticians at the New England Research Institute, particularly Carol Link, who is a classically trained mathematical statistician who knows about these experiments, we've been doing this series of experiments. And the advantage of an experiment, unlike an observational study, is they provide unconfounded estimates of cause-effect relationships. So we've been doing experiments. So what I'm going to describe very briefly and give some results and wrap this up is two experiments. All this is within one program. This is in one project, but it has two experiments. First experiment presented a patient with undiagnosed symptoms clearly suggesting diabetes. And we presented this case to primary care doctors who are in the community. And 98% of all diabetes is diagnosed and managed in the United States by primary care doctors, not by endocrinologists or diabetologists. That's where it's seen, out there by family practitioners, internists, general practitioners. So when we presented the undiagnosed case, this is the case I'm going to describe in a minute, the physician's task in this experiment was to diagnose the case and order the test that was required, like a blood test to measure blood sugar, to confirm that this was in fact diabetes. That's what the clinical guidelines say they should do. The second case was a case of already diagnosed diabetes, but the person presented with an emerging foot neuropathy. And the task there was to manage the case, not to diagnose it, already diagnosed. So we're looking at 2 different tasks and 2 experiments within the study. The doctors will receive these cases in random order. They never saw them in the same order, so there was no confounding there. And the task of the second case is to manage the case. We're only going to look at the first one. Now, why am I focusing on diabetes? Because that's the tsunami of the 21st century, according to the World Health Organization. It's an emergency. So I was starting out my research career today. Right now, I would probably start with diabetes. It is the very interesting disease, very interesting phenomenon in society, and it's obviously going to swamp us. We are going to be swamped, and we can never treat our way out of this problem. Another interesting piece of diabetes is that it's subject to the rule of halves. Half of all the diabetics in American society are not diagnosed. Of the half that are diagnosed, only half of those are treated. And of those half that are treated, only half are well managed, like hypertension. It is an enormous problem. The average person in the United States who was first diagnosed with diabetes has had the disease 7 to 10 years before they're first diagnosed, and it's often by accident. Some kind of metabolic a series of tests, and they find that there might be a problem. Most of it is presented to and still managed by primary care doctors, and as you saw before, the race-ethnic disparities are accepted as real. Now I'm going to go back, and the important point about this here, and I want to say this, is these people make it into these roads, and at the end of each road there is a corral or whatever holds sheep. If I was doing this in New Zealand, I would do it with sheep, with a person sorting the sheep out. But it doesn't work in the United States. But at the end of that, so all these guys with heart disease end up in the heart disease corral. Then you've got all the women in this depression corral down here, right? Now, epidemiologists do what sociologists call reify. They think that these different rates at the end of these roads are real. And if they're real, you've got to look for biophysiologic genetic explanations. Because they're real, but they're not real. They're in the head of this guy here who's blowing the whistle. Now, is this true? Or is this just McKinlay fantasy? Well, let's see. So, these race to ethnic differences are real. They're absolutely, everyone believes them here, right? So there are 2 parts to the experiment. There's the patient side of the experiment, and there's the physician side. On the patient side, the patients we presented, all these factors are orthogonal, by the way. So we presented a patient who was young, 35, or 65, older. That was for Dave Abrams' benefit. Or Richard's benefit. So, and then you've got gender, female or male. You've got black, Hispanic and white, and you've got socioeconomic status. And we indicated that by saying that they were a janitor or a lawyer, and we changed their dress. All these patients were on video. Then we went to the doctors. We looked at, because we know there are big differences in diagnosis depending on whether you go to a female or a male doctor. We know that age is important, and all these doctors had to be US trained. Now, in some new studies we're going actually to using international medical graduates, because as you all know, in the United States now, in many areas of the country, 50% of primary care doctors are international medical graduates. So I would have changed this a little bit now. Let's go to the patient factors. So there we go again. These are the component factors of the intervention. The patient was 35 or 65, male, female, race, ethnicity, and they were either a janitor or a lawyer. Now, just so you get a sense of how this is done. This is a picture of a black actor. So we develop all these scripts, and we go to New York, and we can't go to, it's like Hollywood, and we recruit, we tell a casting agent we need a black, white actor, overweight, male, female, older, young, blah, blah, right? And they go out and we have to screen them, but they have to be all like the same, right? And then we go to a film company called, Hands On Productions, and they do the filming. Now we use this production, they're best in the United States. Every single video is exactly the same. So if the patient says, I've got chest pain, what do? They use the Levine fist. Anyone know what the Levine fist is? You get a patient to describe cardiac symptoms and they say, it hurts here, and they put it over the sternum. That's a dead giveaway that it's a coronary disease. It's called the Levine fist. Levine, not Sol Levine, this was a cardiologist called Levine. And when a patient says it's like a crushing pain, women don't do it like that. They say it's other places. But men, Levine fist. So if you want to put Levine fist in the video, every Levine fist is right there at the same time. These are with 22 takes with each one of these videos to get it exactly right. Right? If the patient is stressed out and like that, that's all in. So we've got to do these. There's a guy desperately learning his lines, right, to get the sense. Now let me tell you, here's some of these actors. This is the African-American older guy in the diabetes study. Now, as you can tell, which one here is the janitor and which one is the lawyer. Although I know some lawyers who look a little bit disreputable. But the guy on the left, now understand, in one audience I was talking about this, they didn't realize that the two on the top are the same guy. The two on the bottom are the same guy. So the guy on the left at the bottom, white, older guy, janitor. So they were told it was janitor, and they were the clothes we put on him. On the right, he was a lawyer, and they were the clothes we put on him. Right? And this is, every one of these is identical. So you've got the guy who's learning his lines, and we go at it. Now, then what do we put in the video? So you're going to put real signs and symptoms. So there are clinicians here in this audience, and a patient presented with thirst, fatigue, a loss of weight for 5 months, change, not feeling well, and generally overweight. Now, overweight is a non-verbal cue in the video, understand? They're all overweight. Everyone, when I go to rounds at Mass General, everyone says, well, John, what are you asking? Clearly, this is diabetes. Well, that's what you'd think. Now, all the clinicians we work with say, well, you know, John, the problem with these videos is, you know, sometimes they're not real. Patients don't present as textbook cases. They always throw in some distractions, and they lead you down the wrong road. So you've got to put some distractions in, not to make the tasks more difficult for the doctors, but to ensure clinical authenticity. Because no one presents, you know, listen, it's like chest pain. I can really act some chest pain if you want. You know, as though I'm having a heart attack. Or I want to do that because Abe Lilienfeld didn't he? When he had the, but anyway, but you can do it, but it's too classic. So you've got to throw some distractions in. So we threw the distraction is that the nurse at the clinic took his patient, one blood pressure, and it was 135 over 95. And the patient said, you know, I'm a bit worried about heart disease in my family. I've been drinking a lot of caffeine lately. Well, I don't know what the hell that means, but it was a distraction which the doctors thought should be taken into account, might explain their anxiety about. And they said they hadn't been to a doctor for several days. They were all the distractions that we put in to make this not difficult, but more authentic. Now, these clinical scenarios, videos, at one point in time, people used to wonder about the issues of external validity. That's now past. People at this field has moved on so much more, and now we can take account and make improvements. The advantages of the videos over standardized patients are simple. Standardized patients are never standardized. So you never know what they're really presenting. And we know from recent work in Canada that 25% of the doctors who saw standardized patients knew that they were seeing standardized patients. So they didn't fool anyone. The other thing about written vignettes, people say, why don't you use written vignettes? Well, the problem with written vignettes is people don't present to doctors as on paper. And when you say, well, this is an elderly black guy, you're priming the doctor. Or you're saying there's an overweight black guy, where these things are usually presented without comment in a medical encounter. The guy is overweight and he's a minority. Or a woman, so whatever it is. Cost, of course, standardized patients are very, very expensive, whereas a cost of these can be used over and over again, these videotapes. And then you can embed non-verbal cues, which you cannot do with a standardized patient or always with a written vignette, as I mentioned, because it primes the doctor. Low affect, anxiety. And I've been around the Mass General for so long now, the doctors tell me the same thing all the time. Look, John, you've got to understand, it's not what the patient says, it's how they look. So we think that this is the way to go. Now, I've done that one. So now on the other side we had to find the doctors. These are randomly sampled doctors, and as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at two levels in this experiment. The ones who are more experienced and less experienced, that's a surrogate for age, and we separated them in order to get, made those under 5 years and over 15 years, and males and females. In other studies we've done, we do more complicated sampling. I'm just giving you this. 192 were required, 48 in each of those cells, which gives tons of power to look at what we wanted to look at. 78% chance to detect the difference of 0.20, 93 to detect the difference of 0.25. So tons of power, and that's all we needed, 192 dots, to get the power we wanted. And then then there's the problem, well, you know, doctors don't really behave in reality with these videos as they do when they see real patients, John. So you really have to be concerned about external validity. Internal validity is really strong, but external validity is threatened. Now, with all those observational studies I talked about before, the internal validity sucks, but the external validity is great. In this case, it's the opposite. So we know that the internal validity is good, we've got to do something about the external validity. So we developed these scenarios through role-playing with doctors, and these are really composite cases they see. We field tested these with a bunch of other doctors who were not part of the study and weren't part of the development. We used real professional actors. You've got to pay actors' rates, by the way, that's not cheap. And if you film for 2 or 3 hours in the morning, you have to pay them for the whole day because that's what the union requires. It's pretty difficult. When we go to New York, we have experienced clinicians. I could have shown you pictures of this going on, but I didn't save time. We have experienced clinicians who see patients every day at the filming to make sure these are authentic. We insist that all of the interviews are done in doctors' offices, not at professional meetings or in their homes, because that's always atypical. So they are seeing a real patient before and after they see the video patient. And then we ask them specifically, please, would you treat this patient as you would one of your own real patients? And finally, in the survey, we ask them, how typical is the patient in the video? They say, I saw that case this morning. They are absolutely convinced that this is a real case. 92% is typical or very typical of what they see. So the external, we do everything we can to improve external validity, can't guarantee it, but the internal validity is fine. So, are we up for some results? So, the results and then the conclusions. So we presented these doctors, 192, with this scenario of the patient, right? Only 60% got the diagnosis right. That's their principal diagnosis. No wonder 50% of diabetes in the United States remains undiagnosed. Now, we weren't trying to hoodwink these doctors. These were symptoms and signs that everyone should have got. And these are randomly sampled doctors. This wasn't from a hospital or a low-income area community health center. These were randomly sampled doctors from all out throughout the state. Rural areas, urban areas. Do you know that mental health, depression, got a higher diagnosis rate than diabetes, even though the signs and symptoms of diabetes weren't embedded in the script? Now, we've done a study of depression, and we used the old Siggy caps, and I can never remember the Siggy caps, but it's sleeplessness, psychomotor retardation, negative affect, all those. We didn't put suicidal ideation in because it's too much of a giveaway. But all the other signs of depression, right? Going off your diet, all those things. And we didn't put any of those in, but they diagnosed mental health, more often mental health problems, or depression actually, and thyroid Thyroid, nothing in the thyroid, nothing really on coronary heart disease except that distraction that there was someone in their family that had a heart attack. Cancer, nothing there, and anemia, right? Now, we also, following Milt Weinstein's approach, we also ask about diagnostic certainty. So you say, okay, how certain are you that that's the right diagnosis? 1 to 100. And if they're absolutely certain, they say 100. If they say I don't have a clue, maybe 3 or 4. And here is the certainty of these diagnoses, box and whiskers, and they basically, these certainty levels mirror the diagnoses. So they're real certain, 60% on average, that this is depression, way down there on diabetes, thyroid, and so forth. Got it? So they're not very good. Now, that's our overall. Now, what about with respect to race, ethnicity, which is where we really started? So we have this, diagnosis by race, ethnicity. So if you are a black patient presenting, 75% of those got diabetes diagnosed. If you were white, less than 50%. Now, you have to understand that every single patient presented exactly the same signs and symptoms. So this is not good behaviour. What about certainty? No, I didn't do certainty there. So, that, you get the pattern there? Now let's put that pattern there of diagnoses by race, ethnicity, highly significant 009, next to the slide we started out from the N. Haynes. On the right, we have N. Haynes. And on the left, we have the experimental results from our clinical decision-making study. The question I'm asking you is, to what extent does the right reflect the left? So the salient points that I've presented are, all the patients in the study presented with exactly the same signs and symptoms of diabetes. Only 60% of the doctors could correctly identify diabetes as the principal diagnosis. There were significant race-ethnic differences, 73% when the patient was black, 48% when white. It doesn't quite match what I showed you, but you get the point. Differences in diagnostic certainty, which I thought I'd put in, were significant and mirrored those differences. Many other conditions were diagnosed with even higher levels of certainty. And I didn't mention the point that only 24% of the doctors who initially diagnosed diabetes would not order any blood glucose test to confirm it, as is recommended by the clinical guidelines. This is randomly sampled doctors. So, what are the implications and conclusions? I suggest that many factors contribute to health disparities, and that's where I started with that multi-level model. Biologic factors, risk factors, behaviours, system factors, etc. And what I've been focusing on is the contribution of diagnostic decision-making by primary care doctors as a possible contributor to the social construction of diabetes disparities. I believe physicians are pivotally involved in the social construction of race-ethnic disparities, and I believe that this source remains largely understudied, despite several reports from the Institute of Medicine saying that in order the next generation of work to look at disparities should focus on provider behaviour. And I believe that the optimal research approach to disentangle the process is factorial experimentation, because it's the only way to get definitive, unconfounded results. So when we say that these decisions varied by race, in the ANOVA, everything else is controlled. Can't get that with an observational study. So we know that all the other factors were controlled. So when it's race, ethnicity, everything else is controlled. So it's a real effect. Can't get that without a design, for sure. So widely accepted conclusion here, widely accepted race-ethnic differences in diabetes do not accurately reflect the true prevalence of diabetes in the US population, and most controversially, while healthcare providers work very diligently to reduce and eliminate race-ethnic disparities, they are pivotally involved, probably unconsciously, in their creation and amplification in society. Thank you very much.
We have time for some questions, so why don't you stay up here, John? I'll start while people are getting their questions together by asking whether you found differences in doctors' diagnosis of these patients based on the janitor-lawyer distinction and the male-female as well.
No, very little difference, by the way, by gender, although there are some things on the second scenario, management. So they would. That was very clear that they would do the things with the foot neuropathy. I can't remember. With the foot neuropathy, you're supposed to do three things. You're supposed to check for ulcers. You're supposed to do a monofilament test, you know, and there's some and a prick or something, there was a clear effect of socioeconomic status on whether the doctors did that. The value of this study is that it also looked at the doctor factors, and we found from my reading of this, if I want to get a new primary care physician, if I wanted to select a new primary care physician from our data, I would select a female physician who is newly trained. I would. I mean, because in our study we asked, what are the outcomes we look at? We asked them, make a diagnosis, any tests that you would order, any prescriptions that you would write, any lifestyle recommendations that you would make, any referrals that you would make, when would you want to see the patient again? So there were 6 outcomes we looked at, and the female doctors asked more questions, which they did better than the male doctors. There wasn't a big effect, and by the way, in the study design, the doctor factors that influence things control for all the other things in the model, including all the patient factors. So, the lower class patients got slightly less in terms of the testing, and the female doctors did more testing. So there was an effect on the testing, but not on this, not on diagnosis.
Yes, and let me recommend that people come to the microphones because we are taping this for a future delayed showing.
I didn't know that. I wouldn't use some of the language I used.
You were. I'm sorry. I just remembered this. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
My name is Darius Guyton, and my question is, so how do you determine the true epidemiologic prevalence? I'm imagining that you had your patient subset and you knew the ones who had diabetes and didn't. And are you comparing what the physician's diagnosis diabetes to that subset as the true epidemiologic prevalence of diabetes?
The only way to get the true epidemiologic rate is to take a random sample from the general population with a high response rate and calculate it from that. So if you're using institutional databases, existing medical records, or discharge data or something like that from the system, you've already selected out all those people who don't make it to the system. And you're also assuming that the doctor makes the right diagnosis. So the only way to really do it is to take a random. I'm doing some work right now on what we're calling, which I think the NIH should do more of, enigmatic illness. About 30 to 40% of all patients who present to the doctor have no discernible organic pathology. It's a big problem, high costs. So with my colleagues at NERI working on this, this work, we're looking at a thick condition which is a bit of a problem, mainly for women, but it happens to men, called interstitial cystitis. No one knows what the hell it is, but it's come to, and then NIH struggle mightily with how to define it. Is it interstitial cystitis? Is it painful bladder syndrome? Is it painful bladder, pain of bladder origin? I mean, no one knows, but it's there. And if you define it as we do now, is pain when the bladder fills, pain relieved upon emptying, which lasts for 3 months. That's the sort of classical definition of this condition. Now, if you do a study like we did, if you're a young man like you, and you had those problems, you'd be diagnosed with prostatitis, right? If I had that problem, I don't have that problem, but if I had that problem, just remember that, Dave. If I had that problem, I would get a diagnosis of BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia. You would get a different treatment than I would. I would get a different treatment for BPH. And then if a woman, my wife, went in with it, she would be diagnosed as interstitial cystitis, and she could get something else, even surgery. Same condition. So if you use these institutional databases to get your population prevalence, you've got the problem of who selection bias into the system. So you're leaving out 50 million Americans who don't have health insurance.
Has that been done?
Yes, it has been. And then you've got the problem of once you make it in, all these variable diagnoses, it's maybe not real. So you've got to remove the filters in the process to a rate in order to get the blue circle.
Just one more question. Do you fear there could be health consequences if physicians, I guess I should say background that I just finished my first year of medical school. And so what we're trained, when a patient comes in, you should go through this differential diagnosis as a way to proceed with care. Yeah. And so do you fear that there may be a danger if you don't consider a patient's weight or health to kind of lead you down the road? I mean, I guess if you just...
Yeah. Of course, yeah, I do. I think in American medicine, as you know, the amount of face time, our videos are only 6 or 7 minutes long. That's the amount of face time that you have with the doctor. Now, the visit could be 10 to 15 minutes. If someone takes your blood pressure and takes a urine sample or whatever, But the amount of time that you actually face time that you have with the doctor under today's corporatized medicine, which is a production line, used to be more. Used to be 15 minutes, but now it's, and now it's throughput. So if you've got this production line, and doctors today are now on salary. There's no in our surveys, we don't find a solo practitioner anymore. Everyone's a corporate employee. And what counts when you're a corporate employee is throughput. So the amount of face time with the doctor that you're going to be experiencing is going to get shorter and shorter and shorter. So 6 to 7 minutes. In other countries, like in Germany and Britain, it's like 15. So how much time do you have in 7 minutes to do all the things that you're supposed to do? The guy who was the father of the Framingham Heart Study, called Bill Cannell, on the Framingham Heart Study, we were on a panel together at the American Heart Association in Worcester, Massachusetts. Enormous audience there. He was talking about these things. And he was talking about the Framingham Heart Study. And he said, this is what you've got. There was 800 or so people who are primary care doctors. So he got up for his talk and he said, this is what you've got to do. You've got to do an enzyme series. You've got to find out about the personality, smoking history, blah, 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 And this guy got up from the back of the hall and he said, Dr. Cannell, he said, how do I do that when I have 6 minutes with the patient and 15 waiting in the waiting room? Because the system schedules them, So the problem is that we in the behavioral science, we know that these risk factors are important. I'm not completely dismissing them. But in modern medicine today, there is no time to do an adequate physical history and all the empathetic things because most patients come in with anxiety. That's not taken care of in the medical encounter. And the other thing is there are no opportunities for really good patient education. If you are diagnosed today in a urologist's office with prostate cancer or prostate problems, who's going to give you information on what your options, seeds, radiation, TERP, robotic surgery, whatever it is? Who's going to do that? There's no time. Same with type 1 diabetes. It used to be a week-long program at the Children's Hospital in Boston to teach families how to manage type 1 diabetes. Abolished. So it's really not anymore a patient-centered system. And I think doctors are in the middle and are squeezed because they have to do throughput. Sorry.
I think it was,
One.
yes, over here.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk. If I understood the talk correctly, you said that we've got physician behaviors causing certain statistics to appear when we do our epidemiological studies.
Right.
And we've got the statistics from our epidemiological studies causing physician behaviors, right?
Yes, it's a circular process.
Okay. So I'm just going to ask the natural question. How did this all get started? Do you have any guess?
How did it all get started? I think that clinical epidemiology got involved in diagnostic practice, and doctors were taught to be good Bayesians. In other words, when you look at a patient like you think of the base rate, what is sometimes known as the a priori probability. Now, what's the chance that you would have X? So I look at you, and there are studies that sociologists have done who do qualitative work that a lot of diagnoses are made in the first few seconds of the encounter. You know, I remember I started out, as you may remember, Dave, in an obstetrics and gynecology department at Aberdeen University in Scotland. And I remember the chief of obstetrics and gynecology used to tell all the staff that if you can't make a diagnosis when the patient comes into the room, or when you see them it's in a minute, you'll never make a living. Now, what I'm saying is that doctors look at patients. This is how they're taught: deductive, hypothetical, deductive reasoning, and Bayesian probability. Look at you. Now, what's the probability? Pretty low, right? So that affects your behaviour. That confirms the rate. It's a circular process, if you understand. You define a situation as real, it's real. So they appeal to these rates that they themselves, through their diagnostic practices, have created as justification for what they're doing, and it perpetuates it. So it's a sort of a circular process. That's what I was trying to get to. I'm sorry if I didn't explain it well.
No, I understood that. But when you have sort of a feedback loop, the natural question to ask is, how does something like that get started?
In medical school. In medical school.
Can you be more specific?
I'll tell you, I was telling you earlier, Archie Cochrane, you know the Cochrane collaborators around the world. I knew Archie Cochrane very well when I was in Britain. And when he was writing his famous book. And he said to me, John, let me tell you something. Doctors don't have 35 years of experience. They have 1 year multiplied by 35. So what they are taught, they do over and over and over again. So if you're taught that kids with middle ear infection should be given penicillin, that happens for 40 years. Most people do not change the behaviour. I still do stuff that I was taught 40 years ago in New Zealand. People just tend to do it. And CME doesn't really work, continuing medicine. People do the same old thing. So where does it start? I think it starts in medical school. And the biggest problem, as we were talking about earlier, for behavioural and social sciences, I think, is how do you change doctors' behaviour? We always talk about changing patients' behaviour, which don't do so well, but how we change doctors' behaviour. So I think it starts, to be honest, and put it simply, in medical school, and that becomes the cognitive basis upon which all other knowledge rests. And you can't restructure it.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
I'm interested in there was a study published in the proceedings of the NAS last year, also using NHANES for, and it was black-white differentials, and they were using the biomarkers, and unfortunately I don't know which ones, but the whole thing about the NHANES is they have not only the self-report, has a doctor ever told you you have disease X, but they've also got a range of measures.
Yeah.
And what this analysis found was that in 3 successive waves of NHANES, there was a big black-white differential in the early period, in the 1970s, in undiagnosed diabetes,
Right.
and that's narrowed so that in other words, they've caught up so that by the last period, the most recent, blacks with the bad levels of the insulin control. I'm not sure what it was.
HbA1c.
And whites with the bad levels were close to equally being likely to say, yes, the doctor's told me I have diabetes. And what that argument was that doctors weren't creating the differential in the prevalence. That what they were doing was catching up to it.
Yeah.
Do you have,
does
that fit
the
with
data that I'm reporting from Ian Haynes was, has the doctor ever told you?
Yeah. But there's something to compare that to. It's not just purely in their heads. There were actual biomarkers, and there was urine and blood.
What I haven't, so we've got two studies here. I've got a big community-based study, and I haven't looked at the real prevalence of diabetes in that study. I should look at it. What I've looked at in the experimental study is what the doctors did. There's a sort of there's a disjunction. So I can check it out.
See, but it was that the doctors, you mentioned doctors are Bayesians, and at least this one would say that they're correct to diagnose diabetes more time. I mean, they're obviously not correct to diagnose everything and the sort of random, but that they would be right if they diagnosed
Let me remind you
diabetes more
what I said in the
blacks
talk,
than whites.
is that every patient, every video, every physician saw exactly the same patient.
And so it was this,
It was there.
All they were reporting was their priors rather
That's right.
than.
That's exactly right. They all saw exactly the same patient. So if they were really being good clinicians and attending to the signs and symptoms of disease, I think there shouldn't have been any difference between the racial ethnic groups, but there was. And it's because I think they're attending to their priors.
Yeah, but their priors were rightly different by race, were rightly affected by race if the biomedical, if the biomarker evidence is correct, which I don't know, but.
I don't think, and I don't think that is correct. But it's an interesting point.
Hi. Would you know if these patterns that you've observed, whether or not they would hold in different countries like Canada, where the healthcare incentive structure is different than the United States, or?
Well, it's interesting that you should say this. This study, which we're doing on diagnostic decision-making for diabetes, is actually being done in 2 other countries. Exactly the same patients. It's being done in the National Health Service in Britain with a completely different system of care, and it's being done in Germany. Now, it's an incomplete design for Germany because the German doctors, when we were beginning this, they don't see any black patients at all. British doctors see Afro-Caribbean patients, but they don't see Hispanic patients, so it's a little bit complicated. So what we have is the white patient in 3 countries, the black patient in 2 countries in the study. And there are considerable differences in the management of the patient in the different countries. And these doctors in the different countries are looking at exactly the same patient. Now let me tell you what we did. We shot these videos and then we changed the accents. So, for example, you can dub it so well now, these production companies, that you'd never know that this was English as opposed to American English. And they the same, about 90% thought these were real cases. In Germany, you had to dub it in German. And this is being done near Düsseldorf. And what we were looking at there is to see to what extent the international differences in disease rates, which are widely reported in journals, are really real, or is it a function of the way doctors in different countries diagnose exactly the same case? And we find, in fact, there are big differences. And also in the very big differences, particularly in the management. You know, I said there was 2 experiments. I only reported the first one. The second one was the peripheral neuropathy. And there were big differences in what doctors did in the different countries. And it's not so much controlling for everything. It wasn't the patient. It wasn't the physician. It was the system. In the United States, there was a lot done because doctors in the United States get paid for doing more. Right? The more you do, the more you get paid under American system. In the British system with nationalised health service, with per capitation, You get more money if you do less. Not saying which is right or wrong, I'm just saying that the system seems to be important. So, yeah, there are international differences. And I think that when you look at these epidemiologic journals, and I contribute to this literature quite a lot, and you look at these international differences in rates, I wonder if they're really real differences, because they're considered to be real. So you look at people in France smoke, you know, and different Mediterranean diet, and these explain all these differences in rates between countries. Or is it that doctors in different countries diagnose and manage the same case differently, and that accounts for the differences in rates? If you want to see that, I don't mean to push this work, but there's a paper in Health Services Research, 2006, which I wrote, which is called How Do Doctors in Different Countries Manage the Same Patient? And this was exactly, they saw the same patient in all countries except for the language. So there we go. Go ahead.
Hi, Lee Herring with the American Sociological Association. You raised a lot of fascinating questions here, and I have a number of them, but I'll try to contain myself. Just a few technical questions. What was the pretext given to the physicians as to why they were looking at patients on video?
Well,
What was the pretext given to the physicians as to why they were supposed to be diagnosing the patient? Did I miss something?
we called them up and we said we're doing a study. It's supported by the NIH, and we're interested in the way in which doctors make decisions.
Okay.
And we wondered if you could spare us an hour. We'd come, you know, they get paid, have to sign an informed consent, got to say that, right? And they get paid $100.
Okay.
And it's very hard work. I mean, the response rate for physician surveys in the United States now is really, really bad, mainly because of corporate medicine, because there are gatekeepers who keep you away. But if you're really lucky, you get 60. We got 67, but you're very lucky you can get 65%.
Right, right.
But since it's an experiment, right, Libby, and not a survey, it's not quite as crippling.
Did you get any sense from your work as to why a larger percentage of the physicians were not ordering up tests? These are primary care physicians,
Yeah.
so that might be part of it, but is there another aspect of it? Because I'm fascinated by that, I mean, in our own lives, of course, we're expert pattern recognizers, and we see
Yeah.
things and we act on it, and we don't have to go any further, but...
Well, I'll tell you what we are doing. So this we've just about run out of time, haven't we? I'll just answer this question, and I'll tell you what it is. So this doctor decision-making work, it's gone through various generations. So talking about talking sociologies for a minute, the first generation of work looked at patient factors, and we looked at coronary heart disease. I mean, all of this work's been done in coronary heart disease. Male presents with coronary symptoms, he gets CHD, goes stress test, right? Woman presents with CHD, all the same symptoms, doesn't get it diagnosed. That's well known. I mean, it's been reported over and over and over again. So we started with patient factors like age, social class, gender, race, ethnicity, so forth. That was the first generation of work. That was way back in like the 80s. The second generation work looked at physician factors. So what you get depends on the age of the doctor, the specialty, the gender, the practice setting, and so forth. And that, we've published a whole bunch of stuff on that. That's the second generation of work. This work is evolving. And sometimes the physician factors blow away the patient factors in the model. More important who you see than what you have. And that's the concerning part about this, is the way in which patients are diagnosed is not what they present with, is basically who they are and who they see. Then the third generation of work looked at system factors, so you'll be interested in that in organization theory. And we were talking about this. There's a guy called Corral in Minnesota who has a scale for measuring practice culture. It's fascinating. It's different practices, doctors' practices have different cultures. Some are make money, some are science, some are patient-centered, and so forth. He has shown in a number of publications that what doctors do varies by organizational culture. So that's the third, and he's got a so-called validated scale. You understand problems with that. And then the next generation of work is what we're just doing now, which is inside the doctor's head. How do they get to these decisions? And you can't do a survey. So here I think there's a very good role for qualitative research. Well done, rigorous qualitative research that's replicable. So what we do is we do what you may be aware of is called think aloud. So you've got you've got to train the interviewers very well. And you fill in the questionnaire, you're going along, and after you get the doctor to declare what's the diagnosis, what's the test, what's the certainty, blah, 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 then you stop the interview. Then you turn on the tape recorder. And you go back and with an unstructured script, like a focus group, where you have a whole series of topics, in an unstructured way, you get the doctor to talk about why they did this rather than something else. What was it about the patient that triggered them to do this? Well, I didn't prescribe them metformin because look at the bugger. He's not going to do a damn thing. He can't control his smoking. He's overweight. He's out of this, that, can't keep a job. How the hell do you think he's going to follow the medication? People make assumptions. You'd never get that in a survey. So what we do is we've got 20 odd topics in this thing, and the interviewer, tape recorded, winds them through as a conversation the 20 topics. The only instruction we give them is let the doctor talk about anything they want to talk about in the order that they want to talk about, but the only thing is you've got to cover all 20. So they do it their own way, and they check them off as they go. This is about 10 to 15 minutes of the interview. We take that, we transcribe it, and we do very detailed conversation analysis. And the first paper that's coming out on that work is coming out, just been accepted in Social Science and Medicine. It's by a colleague of mine called Karen Lutfi, who is both a qualitative and a quantitative researcher, but mainly qualitative. And she's joined NERI, and she's doing this fantastic work, really doing very fine textual analysis of the reasons that doctors are giving. What it is about class, for example, is not class. What is it about class that causes them not to do things, for example? And they say things that are more to do with what Karen calls issues of morality and personal responsibility and cleanliness and things like that, that the doctor has in their head, which comes out in this. It's not, well, because they're working class. It's that a person like that would never, ever follow a detailed retina. They'll never lose weight. They never exercise. They make assumptions. So this is what I call the fourth generation of work, which is the cognitive origins of health disparity.
Could I impose with just one more question?
Yeah,
because it relates
Lee,
to that.
why don't you come up afterwards? We are 5 minutes beyond our
Sorry
time,
about
so
that.
I think that
Thank you very much.
we need to thank our speaker.